Here's a page of pen and ink drawings, and we'll take a look at the materials. There's some acrylic burnt umber ink, a watercolor palette, which we'll look at closer in a minute, a crow quill nib and holder. The paper I'm using is a hot press watercolor paper, which is nice and smooth, an easier surface to draw on than cold press, which has the bumpy texture. So Bristol will work as well as long as it's smooth. I got some paper towel, and if you don't have a crow quill, it doesn't work as well, but you can make a point on a chopstick as a substitute. Let's look at an inspiration drawing. Here's a Rembrandt drawing, and this was pre-steel, and Rembrandt was working on a soft paper. So what he was drawing with was probably a goose feather. And if you take a feather like that and carve it essentially so that it would look basically like your steel crow quill nib does, that was what he was drawing with this brown ink. And he did a lot of great landscape drawings as well. Here's one where he's also using some ink and wash along with the nib. Here's a Peter Paul Rubens drawing where he's imitating Michelangelo, because Michelangelo is great at this cross hatching, especially the kind of curving cross contour cross hatching. Michelangelo was a sculptor, so his cross hatching really comes out of how he would carve out the form. So it comes from a really thorough understanding of what he was seeing. So if you want to get better at cross contour cross hatching, he's a really great artist to take a close look at.
All right. So before we start drawing, we want to make some dilutions with ink. So don't be intimidated by the ink. The first thing we're going to do is take our ink and thin it out so it's not as intimidating to draw with it. So what I have here is one of these little watercolor palettes. I filled each of these with water except for one. So I'm going to fill one with pure ink, and then I'm just going to dilute it out. This ink is fairly transparent, so you want to experiment with ink you have. Some inks are very strong. This ink is a little weaker. So you can see as I basically just cleanse out the dropper in it, or if you want to just rinse out a brush in it, if your ink doesn't come with a dropper, that works as well. And there you see I have dilutions of ink. So this is a crow quill nib. It's a steel nib. It's flexible. And once we get a little ink on it, if you're having trouble getting your ink to flow, usually it's the tines aren't touching at once. This has two tines, like the tines on a fork. If they're not both touching the paper, the ink comes from between those two tines on the paper. So if it's just the side or the other side, it may not give you any mark at all. So if it's not working, the first thing is are both tines touching? Second, if it's not working, sometimes diluting your ink a little bit can help. A lot of inks are, this ink I'm using is acrylic based, some inks are shellac based. Either way, things tend to clog. Also, holding it like this, water wants to flow downhill, so that's going to give you a better result as well. You want one of these that goes to a fine point that you can control with the pressure on your hand. They do have ones that have sort of a chiseled nib like this. That's really for calligraphy. So you don't want, if your nib looks like that and you have to kind of use the side of it, you don't want that. Another thing that can work for you if you don't have a nib is a chopstick. You just want to whittle it away so that it has more of a point to it. You can experiment a little bit with the point you put on this. I just basically want to make it sharper. So this is not optimal. It's not as good as a steel nib. It's not going to give you that flexible line quality that's responsive to your touch. That'll make your drawings look more lively as a whole. But if you don't have one of those and you have a chopstick and an X-Acto, or this is just a box cutter, you can make something, an improvised one that you can put a point on. And if we dip that point in the ink, you can see we can get a thick line, but the chopstick holds enough ink, sort of like the nib, and it will work. It's a little bit more like a felt tip, and you notice my line was darker when I started and lighter when I ended up as the ink dilutes out. So this is sort of a plan B, like an emergency plan you can try this assignment with if you don't have a crow quill nib that's steel, but it still gives you can get a little bit of line variety out of it. So you notice the little hole that the nib has right there? That's really your gas tank on your nib. So another thing that can happen is if you just dip the very tip of the point into some ink or diluted ink, then it doesn't really fill up your little gas tank very much. So if you really dip it in, and I can see now I have a full tank, I'll be able to get many more lines on the page. And you also want to be delicate with it. You don't want to smash your nib down. You can, with a change in pressure, you can go from a very fine line to a really thick line, but you don't want to push hard all the time and get impatient if your ink isn't flowing. So if it's not flowing, remember, try diluting it first and make sure both tines are touching the paper. Also, I tend to keep a little bit of paper towel around so I can wipe the nib out every once in a while, because no matter what your ink is based in, that stuff can sort of clog up the ink flow, and that can be another reason your ink isn't flowing well. So those are the troubleshooting setup things. So let's get to drawing. So the first thing I want you guys to try drawing with this is just our old friend, the sphere. So let's just have, let's say the light's coming from top right, and we'll start with ink that's a little bit diluted. And just, first of all, make a little ball. Then start building up the lines. So once I decide where the light is coming from and where the sphere is going to be in light and dark, I'm just going to start making lines. You notice I go in one direction only. You can go in two directions, but it gives you less control. And this really, since it's ink and it stays put, if I cross hatch in two directions, it tends to get a little bit darker where I turn the corner. So if it's really important to you and you really want to keep control over it, try and go one direction only. So this is actually part of the assignment, is draw a little sphere, because we want to practice using the materials in a sort of limited situation where we're not worried about as many things. If we're trying to draw a figure, we're going to be trying to get a lot of things right. So I just want to get the parts of the shadow on here. And I'm just keeping my line direction consistent. I'm right-handed, so I tend to basically just cross-hatch like this. One of the things you'll notice is when I change direction below the little sphere, that also indicates sort of a change in space. So if you're cross-hatching something, say you're cross-hatching a sphere and you're just going kind of random directions, it's not going to be as smooth or look like it's on the surface as much. You want to change your line direction when you want to show a change in space. So there's an artist, Tiepolo, that's beautiful at doing this. So if my lines are going like this on the sphere, maybe I'll just change direction and go horizontal behind it a little bit, so the sphere can be lighter and darker than what's behind it. Right, so then I can build up my lights and darks more. Now the diluted ink, you can work all the way up into a highlight if you want to have very diluted ink and save like a highlight area out. This is actually pretty hard for me to see, so probably not dark enough. There, that's pretty pale, but if you really want to finish a drawing out, you can go work all the way up into the highlights. So let me build this up. Also, we want to keep our line weight sensitive to the light direction. So if the light's coming from top left,
or actually top right,
we got about 50-50 on the sphere. And you want to just be, I'm being very patient with my lines I'm making. This is a good technique if you feel like you're impatient. It does help you sort of slow down. So now I have most of the parts of the shadow on here. My highlight could be clearer, but I'm starting to turn the parts of the shadow of the sphere. So I have light, shadow, shadow core, a little bit of reflected light in here, a little bit lighter, and a little bit of reflected shadow here. And let's try and work up into the highlight a little bit more clearly. maybe make the whole thing a little darker. So this is sort of a basic exercise, but that's what you want if you're a little bit unsure about the materials. You want something basic so that you can just focus on controlling the materials and not try to do a lot of stuff at once. So let's try and do a little bit more now. Let's go to the figure.
Here's a time lapse of some quick drawings in the pen and ink, and I'm trying to make long lines at first to really get the action down, and then if I have time, a little bit of the volume, a little bit of the plane break in. So making long lines, setting in a little bit of light and dark, and relying on my memory for proportion. So action, volume, and proportion is about all you have time for. I'll do the ones on the left with you now.
And it's really just going to be the same as with a dry media. So we'll try a couple of 2-minute drawings. So we'll start a timer and start our drawing. Maybe to start our pancake drawing, let's see. So we'll get the head. Think of the gesture. Right, the head's an egg. Rib cage, an egg about 1.5 times that size, down to the pelvis. Then the weight-bearing leg. Then the other leg. Now on a drawing this quick, we don't really have time to check proportion, so we really want to make sure we get the gesture. So this sort of leaning forward is super important. Make the gesture clear, got the shoulder over. I'm going to go to pretty dark ink pretty quickly, but I'm using the pressure, which gives me a lighter line. So I really just want to try and get the gesture in. And it's a quick drawing, so normally I do a quick drawing like this a little smaller so I can actually get more in. So maybe I will now I'm going to a more pure ink. Right, maybe I have time for a little bit of light and dark. Gotta be quick about it. All right, so we'll try another one. And same way, we're gonna start with the head. Head, rib cage, pelvis, weight-bearing leg. Weight's maybe more on the back. Now when I'm doing them next to each other, one of the advantages of that is I can kind of piggyback off the proportions of the previous drawing.
So I'm starting with an ink that's slightly diluted and really just trying to get the main masses down.
So,
and then if I have time, get a little bit of the plane break in, go to a little bit stronger ink. So I did one drawing in an ink that was more diluted, which is like a map. Now I'm going back in with ink that's stronger since I'm more confident about where things are going.
How much time I have.
That way I build some fallibility into the drawing. So essentially one really quick drawing to make a map with the diluted ink, and then using ink that's more full strength once I have a little bit of structure in. That way my first guess doesn't have to be so accurate. And again, on a drawing this quick, you don't have really time to check your measurements, so you're relying on what you know about the proportions. So it's really important to check on those long drawings because that's actually what makes the short drawings go more quickly. On your long drawings, when you're checking proportion and correcting, it can hurt a little bit when you have to correct something, but that's what helps you remember your proportions for the short drawings and actually makes them go much more quickly.
So we're gonna go ahead and start, and we want to start with action first, and then when it's really light and we have the gesture down, we want to check proportion, then get to volume, and lastly some detail. So we're gonna dilute the ink to get the gesture down. I got a little bit here already. So again, with the action, we want to think of almost a line of action, which would be a line from, let's say, the top of someone's head's an egg, from the top of the egg down to the bottom of the spine. So the figure's kind of going like that. Right? Look for the axis of the shoulders, axis of the pelvis to help you get those things. So I'm going to do a bigger one here. Thin it down. You want to start with very diluted ink. So wait to use pure ink until you have your proportion really thoroughly, that you've checked it and rechecked it. So I want to start with the head, just like I was singing, a line from the top of the head through the spine down to the bottom of the tailbone. So head, rib cage, pelvis. So if the head's an egg, 1 unit high. Rib cage again is going to be about 1.5 high. And then the pelvis will again be about a head high. So I want to start really light. Think of those main masses and make sure I'm really building the drawing up. You don't want to just copy what you see. You really have to understand what you're seeing to be able to draw it. And I'm gonna go ahead and, so once I get the head, rib cage, and pelvis in a little bit, I know this is starting light, but I want to do a little bit longer drawing, and the longer drawing I want to do, the more I want to stay light at the outset. So that gives me the more chances to redo things, to get things right. So weight-bearing leg, then the other leg. So good places to look for axis: shoulders, pelvis, knees, and feet are good places to look for the axis. Like what's higher, which side is higher. So now I want to make sure he has everything so I can check proportion. And this is a good time to check proportion when things are nice and light and I don't have anything finished. The temptation is everyone wants to skip to detail too quickly, and that does not, it makes it harder to fix later. So now that I have just the basics here, I want to do some checking. I could check on the model. About 4 heads to the bottom of the pelvis. 2, 3, 4. I'm pretty close there. And then we can check from, say, the bottom of the foot here to the bottom of the pelvis and see how far that comes. On my drawing, it comes almost to the top of the head here. And on the model, it is a little bit less than that. So I think I elongated the legs a little bit. So I think that's got to come up to about there. So this is the time to notice that sort of thing before I really touch it with any pure ink, because this ink won't show that much by the time I build up the values a little bit. And it's okay. I'm not gonna get mad and like draw in with pure ink where I meant for it to go, because you don't want to start correcting with darks. Again, that's like shouting someone down in an argument where it doesn't make your argument any better, and you know from design that your eye is drawn to contrast. If you do that, the viewer's eye will be drawn to where you were trying to fix your drawing. So also it's good to have a little scrap area over here so I can check my values. So that was important. I definitely had to make a proportional correction. Before I even start massing out the volume, you really want to check your proportion. And you want to check it more than once. And you also want to check balance. So here's the pit of his neck. So I want to look on him. If I make a straight line down, like a plumb line, where does that fall between his feet on the model? And it's closer to the foot on the left, so it looks like I'm okay on that front. So like an imaginary line straight down like that. And again, my construction lines are maybe more present than they would be if I was just drawing it for myself, but I wanted to show you how I was, what I was looking for to build structure. So that looks a little dark to me for this stage. So now I have, my balance is okay and my proportion is okay. So now I can start getting to volume and eventually to detail. So let me speed this up and we'll have a look at that. But this is the foundation for your drawing. So in a way, this is the most important part once you've gotten the gesture down and you've checked your proportion.
So since we have a foundation, we'll switch over to time lapse to build up the drawing. So I'm really just, since I have the action, the proportion down for the volume, I really like to go over the plane break. So just like on the sphere where the model goes from day to night like a planet. So I'm really just putting in lines for the night side of the planet. And so the day side of the planet shows, I put those lines, again, changing direction for what's behind it to make a shift in space to make the model so he can be lighter and darker than what's behind him. And then really just going back and building up my values from dark to light. So here's a closer look at this. I hope you enjoy this technique. I think it can be a lot of fun, especially if you like line work.